My wife asked if she could travel with her boss on a special trip, and my cruel response was just the silence of someone who already knew too much. I handed her my packed suitcase and the end of our marriage wrapped in a curt goodbye. "No need to come back, this ticket is only a one-way ticket," I left written. She left thinking she would experience something new, something better, perhaps more exciting or less predictable. But she didn't know, or refused to see, that the stability she'd scorned, the silent love she'd cast aside, and the heart she'd taken for granted were breaking from within. Not exploding, but breaking. And what breaks in silence never mends itself the same way again. In the days that followed, the apartment seemed bigger. Cleaner. Quieter. I could have said that loneliness had consumed me. But no. What had consumed me was the echo. The echo of her footsteps leaving, the muffled sound of the door slamming without saying goodbye, the zipper of her suitcase closing with the haste of someone who never looked back. The cutlery remained beside her in the drawer, the socks in her hamper, the smell of shampoo still wafted through the bathroom, but she was no longer there. And yet, in everything, she remained. The first night without her, I sat on the couch and relived the past few weeks. The absent glances, the face-down cell phone, the laughter that no longer included my name. I remembered her excuses, the late meetings, the urgent trips, the automatic smiles when I asked, "Is everything okay?" Betrayal doesn't begin with the touch of skin, it begins with the touch of doubt, of silence, of the invisible distance that sets in even before the stolen kiss. I knew. But knowing doesn't ease the pain. Knowing only turns love into a slow poison. She traveled. And in her absence, I traveled inward. I went to the remains of our love, to the rubble of us both, searching for exactly where she stopped loving me. Because no one betrays someone who still sees. Only someone who has long since turned their backs. And she had already turned hers. Not me. I still loved her. Even knowing. Even afterward. Even in silence. But loving someone who doesn't return is condemning yourself to a life sentence in a cell that smells of someone who left. For weeks, I lived between wounded pride and absurd longing. I was angry. But I was also tender. I imagined her with him, in the places she said she didn't like, laughing at jokes she never laughed with me, wearing clothes she'd previously said didn't match. It was as if she'd transformed into someone else, and that someone else no longer fit into the world I'd built for us. I tried to convince myself she'd done me a favor. That she'd freed me. But no. I knew that there, even with the betrayal, I would have given everything for a second chance. I would have forgiven her if she'd asked first. But she didn't. She chose. When she returned, there was nothing left to save. She walked in as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't fallen apart, as if there was still us. But there wasn't. I looked at her, saw a strange weariness in her eyes, saw the lack of sparkle, and yet I didn't hate her. Because true love doesn't hate. It simply understands. And understanding, sometimes, is worse than hating. She cried. She begged. She said she'd made a mistake, that she felt empty, that she thought she was living a dream, but woke up in a nightmare. She said the other man was cold, that there was no affection, that she'd been used, that she felt stupid, that she wanted me back. And I listened. Every word. As if each syllable were a shovel of lime thrown over the grave of everything we once were. And yet, I forgave. But forgiveness, in that moment, didn't mean return. It meant goodbye. And this time, it was a goodbye with no return. I moved on. But not in a rush. Not to hurt, not to seek revenge, but because I finally understood that love, when it's not reciprocated, becomes survival. And we weren't born to survive a marriage. We were born to live. And it was through living that I found a new perspective. A new smile. A serene love. No games. No absences. No lies disguised as meetings. A love where I fit completely, without needing to shrink. And in this new love, I saw myself again. Not as someone else's reflection, but as my own protagonist. Years later, something happened. She came back. Not to ask again, not to try to get back together. But because she carried a weight on her chest that she no longer knew how to lift. She came to me one random night, saying she dreamed about me every week, that in every dream I held her, that in every dream she told me she loved me, that she was waiting for me, that she asked for my forgiveness. And that in those dreams, I cried. I cried, but I hugged her. I cried, but I forgave her. I cried, but I welcomed her back. She said she woke up every day with wet eyes. That she looked to the side and saw only her pillow. That she talked to herself. That she smelled my coffee. That she heard my voice in the songs. That she smiled at my memories and then cried with the certainty they would never return. And that on that day, the day she came to me, the dream was different. In the dream, she knocked on my door. I opened it. She smiled. She told me she loved me. But I didn't smile. I said nothing. I just looked at her, and closed the door slowly. It was at that moment that she woke up. And he understood. He understood that forgiveness can exist. But that love, sometimes doesn't wait. That there are mistakes that can't be fixed. That there are doors that can't be reopened. And that the greatest punishment for those who betray true love, is waking up from the right dream too late. But what she didn't know, is that that dream wasn't just hers. After all, what happened after that last visit, no one knows. Yet. Welcome to the channel. Here, we've made it clear from the start, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths, because betrayal, even when invented, always leaves real scars. Our purpose is to show, with each plot, how a wrong choice can destroy true loves and change destinies forever. Now, take a deep breath, prepare your heart. You are about to hear a shocking story, one that might make you rethink everything. Good story. Lucas was the kind of man who went unnoticed in crowds, but left deep marks on the few hearts that knew how to look beyond the surface. He had brown eyes that shouted nothing, but held everything. He spoke little, smiled sideways, and listened more than he said. He worked as a graphic designer in a small agency, spending his days surrounded by color, silence, and an almost meticulous discipline. But at home, with her, with Helena, he was different. There was a gentleness in the way he placed his hand on her back as they passed through busy places, as if silently saying, "I'm here." There was an almost artisanal care in the messages he left around the house, simple notes she found stuck to the refrigerator, on the mirror, inside the books she was half reading. They weren't grandiose declarations, but they were always perfectly timed. It was this perfect timing that made Lucas so hard to forget, and so easy to love. Helena, on the other hand, was made of urgency. She was always on the move, had a free laugh, a quick gaze, and an enthusiasm that arrived at places before her. She worked as a communications consultant at a growing company, which meant constant meetings, events, clients, and cell phones that never stopped buzzing. She was admired, praised, and knew the power she wielded. But behind the confidence with which she entered any room, there was an even greater desire, to be understood. Not just loved, that she knew she was, but understood in the silences, in the weariness she couldn't name, in the phases when she didn't even recognize herself. With Lucas, she found refuge from her chaos. He was the respite she couldn't ask for. He was the grounding. Their house was small, but full of details that betrayed who lived there. The walls were adorned with paintings that blended his aesthetic taste with her optimistic quotes. On the bookshelf, design books shared space with dramatic novels and inspiring biographies. There was a worn sofa they insisted on keeping because it was the first they bought together. A cracked vase she accidentally broke, which he glued back together with hot glue and a touch of irony, claiming it was modern art. The bedroom was simple, but the closet smelled of them both. She left her toiletry bag on the sink, and he pretended not to mind. It was an imperfect but incredibly intimate routine. They weren't a couple from a margarine commercial. They fought over trivial things, like any other couple. They argued about using the air conditioning, about bedtime, about who forgot to buy coffee. But there was an invisible strength in their reunions, in their apologies, in the way he waited for her even when she said she didn't need to. Helena thought she was overreacting, too intense, and Lucas just smiled and said that was exactly what made it all worth it. In the eyes of their friends, they were a balanced couple. Those who gazed at each other with complicity across a crowded room. Who danced slowly even when the music was loud. Who preferred dinners at home to nights at bars. She was the laughter, he the comfortable silence. She was the hurricane, he the shelter. And perhaps, for that very reason, no one would ever imagine anything could go wrong. There was a kind of unspoken pact between them, a silent alliance that sustained the imperfections of their life together. He accepted her fast pace, and she accepted his calm. It wasn't easy, but there was enough love to endure the hardest days. At work, Helena began to stand out more and more. New projects, meetings out of town, opportunities that seemed promising. Lucas sincerely rooted for her. He always encouraged her to grow, to challenge herself, to not settle for less. He was proud to see her carve out a niche, even if it sometimes meant taking a back seat. He understood it was temporary, a phase. Weekends began to change. Sometimes she couldn't stay home all Saturday, there were events, there were clients. Some Mondays began with her bags already packed. He didn't complain. He just helped her close her suitcase and made her coffee before she left. It was the kind of love that understands. Or that tries to understand as far as it can. But even the strongest relationships can have invisible cracks. And no one notices when affection starts to become routine. When a kiss on the forehead becomes an automatic gesture. When "take care" starts to sound like protocol. Lucas was attentive, but not invasive. He sensed that something was changing, but he tried not to suffocate. He avoided unnecessary confrontations. He believed that with time everything would fall into place. He thought the love they had was enough. And maybe it was. Maybe it still is. The nights she took a while to respond, he blamed her busy schedule. When her voice sounded different on the phone, he attributed it to fatigue. Never to disinterest. Never to the possibility of being pushed out of a space that was once his. Because true love tends to be blind, but it's a willful blindness. No one wants to see what could destroy what took years to build. Helena was on the move, and Lucas was waiting. Not for lack of love, but for overconfidence. Because he believed that when the dust settled, when the projects were finished, when his schedule cleared, she would return in one piece, as she always did. But returns aren't always complete. And sometimes, the path someone takes away changes who they become when they try to return. Friends noticed the distance, but no one said anything. Perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear of being wrong. Social media showed smiles, photos together, dinners for two, everything seemed normal. But only those who live within silence know how loud it can be. Lucas heard that scream. He slept next to him. But he didn't know how to talk about it without seeming controlling, insecure, or paranoid. So he kept quiet. And the silence, slowly, carved a space between them. Despite this, there were still good times. There were still shared laughs, movies on Sundays, conversations late into the night. Helena still laid her head on his shoulder sometimes. He still made her chamomile tea when she said she had a headache. The love was there, but something was already beginning to fade, like a photograph slowly fading, unnoticed. And when you do, you can no longer see the face clearly. Lucas kept writing notes. Sometimes he'd leave one on the mirror with phrases like, "Just come back when you have time to lie on the couch with me," or, "The world can wait, but my hug can't." Helena would laugh, sometimes, other times she'd just ignore him. She'd say she was tired, that she couldn't stop now, that all of this was important. He'd agree. He'd say he'd be waiting. He always would be. Daily life was shaped by absence disguised as presence. Breakfast together became a luxury. Lazy Sundays became days of check-ins and flights. Bedtime conversations were replaced by quick voice messages or hasty emojis. And yet, Lucas maintained hope. Because those who truly love don't give up at the first sign of change. Those who love believe that love is a process, a continuous construction, that survives even small absences, as long as there's a return. But there was something in Helena's gaze that Lucas couldn't decipher. Something hugs couldn't contain. Something words couldn't reach. A new kind of emptiness. A different kind of absence. As if she were there, but no longer belonging. And even though he felt this, he still looked at her as he had in the beginning. Like someone who finds peace in the chaos. Like someone who knows no one but her is home. Back then, the days continued with the same semblance of normality. Two adults, sharing the same bed, the same plans, but at different frequencies. Time doesn't shout, it whispers. And the whispers became internal screams for him, but whispers she ignored. Still, the bond held. Or at least he believed it did. Because that's what he was made of, the belief that, if it were love, it would endure anything. Until one day, she asked, and the silence answered. But until then, history had not yet revealed all that it held. Nor what would be lost. Nor what would be forever. The routine continued to stretch like a taut rope between two different worlds. Helena arrived later than usual, no longer offering explanations as before, only short messages letting him know everything was fine, not to worry, that it was just another appointment. Lucas, who had always believed in time as an ally, began to suspect that time was now working against him. The house was quieter, the laughter diminished, and the sofa, which once sheltered two bodies entwined on cold nights, now held only one. Her absence wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, like an emotional absence that sets in even when the body is still present. He missed her even when she was there, sitting a few feet away, on her cell phone, answering emails or laughing at something he didn't understand. The distance had a smell, a texture, and was slowly spreading through the walls, the sheets, the washed glasses stacked in the sink. He began to notice small details. The perfume she once wore for special occasions was now the scent she carried even on a regular Tuesday. Her cell phone, which used to be thrown on the table, now sat glued to her palm, always face down. Notifications, once shared casually, became secrets protected by passwords and averted glances. Lucas had never been the controlling type, but there was something about that change that ignited a new uneasiness, a nagging feeling deep within his soul. He tried not to think about it, tried to justify it with her heavy routine, her fatigue, her desire for professional growth. But there was more. There always is. The problem is that the heart knows first, but the mind refuses to accept it. One night, while organizing some paperwork at home, he found a boarding pass forgotten inside a book she'd taken on her last trip. The date didn't match the one she'd given. The destination was different. It didn't make sense. His heart raced, but he didn't react immediately. He closed the book, put the paper away, and went to the kitchen. He poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. The ice of doubt was beginning to melt inside him, but he needed more. Some confirmation. Or perhaps a better told lie to keep him believing. In the days that followed, he observed. Without intruding, without confronting. He just observed. She began to avoid looking him in the eye for long periods of time. She changed the subject when he asked about details of their travels. And when he said he missed her, she smiled slightly, but didn't say she missed him too. The night everything began to unravel came subtly, as it almost always does with major losses. They were having dinner in silence when she bluntly announced that she would have to travel again, but this time it would be something more special, as she put it. An important event, reserved only for the team's most strategic collaborators. Lucas nodded. He said nothing. He didn't ask any questions. She seemed tense, but she tried to hide it. She said it would only be for 3 days, that she'd barely have time to miss it. He smirked, like someone hearing an old joke. 3 days. 3 nights. 3 abysses. The day before the trip, he prepared her favorite dinner. He lit candles and put on some calming music, as they used to do in the beginning. She arrived late. She said she had a long meeting and almost didn't come straight home. When she entered, she was surprised by the atmosphere. She sat down, thanked him, and ate quickly. She didn't ask about his day. She didn't notice his new shirt. She didn't mention the dessert he'd bought at a special place. It was as if she were somewhere else. And maybe she was. Lucas said nothing. He just watched her with a look that mixed love, disappointment, and a hint of resignation. He didn't know everything yet, but he already knew too much. The next morning, he got up before her. He calmly packed her suitcase. He separated her favorite clothes, folding them precisely, just as she did. He left a simple note attached to the zipper. "Have a good trip." When she woke, her suitcase was already packed at the door. She found it strange, but he simply said he wanted to save her time. She thanked him awkwardly, looked into his eyes for a moment, as if she wanted to say something. But she didn't. She simply kissed his cheek and left with her suitcase in her hands. Lucas stood in the living room, listening to the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, the scrape of the suitcase's wheels. And when the door closed, something inside him closed too. For the next 3 days, he didn't try to contact her. He didn't call, he didn't text, he didn't ask if everything was okay. He was silent. A silence that echoed through every corner of the house. On the 3rd day, she didn't return. She texted late that night saying she'd had an unexpected event, that she'd have to stay another night, but that she'd be back the next day. He responded with a simple, "Okay." No punctuation. No emotion. It was at that moment that she knew something had changed. The next morning, he left early. He went to a cafe downtown and spent hours there, writing, people watching, trying to find meaning amidst the emptiness that was setting in. When he returned home, she was already back. Sitting on the couch, her suitcase beside her, her eyes red but tearless. He walked in without saying anything, took off his shoes, put away his keys, and went to the kitchen. She followed him. He said she needed to talk. That she had made bad decisions. That not everything had turned out as she had hoped. That she had gotten confused. He simply listened. He looked into her eyes and let her speak. And she spoke. She spoke of how alone she felt, of how lost she had become trying to prove something she didn't even know to whom. Of how she had let her vanity make decisions for her. And then, in a low voice, she said she had made a mistake. A grave mistake. Lucas leaned against the wall, crossed his arms, and remained silent. Helena continued. She said the trip had been different, that it wasn't just work. He said it had happened, but he regretted it. That it wasn't premeditated, but neither was it avoided. That it wasn't love, but neither was it just lust. It was a mistake. A mistake with consequences. And now, there, facing him, she didn't want forgiveness yet, she just wanted him to know the truth. The ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. Everything he had feared materialized in words loose in the air. Words that could not be collected. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't make a fuss. He just turned and went to his room. He grabbed a small suitcase, opened the closet, and began packing his things. Helena ran to him and asked what he was doing. He said, in a firm voice, that it was better this way. That he couldn't do it anymore. That he no longer knew where they were. She begged, held his hands, and told him she still loved him. But he just looked at her and said that love doesn't survive everything. And that, at that moment, he needed to love himself more than forgive. He packed his bags and left. He didn't give an address, didn't respond to subsequent messages, didn't answer calls. He disappeared. He was gone for days. She went to her friends, but no one knew. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. He had disappeared not to seek revenge, but to avoid falling apart completely. Days later, she received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a note and a key. The note contained only one sentence: "This was the last space we shared. Keep it." It was the apartment key. Alongside it was a photo torn in half, showing her smiling. Lucas, however, was missing. It wasn't the end of the story yet. There was still something to be revealed. Something she never imagined. Because sometimes, when we think we've caused all the pain possible, we discover there's still more to lose. So much more. Helena spent weeks suspended, living as if time had ceased to exist. Lucas didn't respond. He didn't return. The apartment was empty, but not silent. There were ghosts in every room, memories bumping into the furniture, memories that refused to go away. She continued to live, or at least pretend to. Work, commitments, attempts to move on. But there was a constant emptiness, a wound that wouldn't heal. The betrayal hadn't been just an act, it was the reflection of an abyss she'd unknowingly dug herself, and now she couldn't find a ladder to climb back out. Regret came in the details, in the little things that once seemed like trivial routines but now seemed precious, the way he'd folded his socks, the slow brewing of his coffee, the way he'd said, "Did you get home okay?" as if it were a prayer. But there was no going back. Time passed. She tried to write, tried to search, but Lucas had become absent in every way. He no longer posted anything, didn't frequent the same places, didn't give any signs. And perhaps that was what hurt the most. He wasn't angry. He just moved on. Like someone closing a door without locking it, but knowing no one else will try to enter. Then came the true silence. And with it, the consequence of everything. One night, while sorting through boxes of old things to donate, she found a black folder with printed pages, something Lucas had forgotten or left behind on purpose. Opening it, she saw drafts of texts, notes from an old project, perhaps a book. But what caught her attention were the dates. Every page carried records of feelings, thoughts, doubts, and pain, and they all began in the same month, the month she had taken her first trip with her boss. Helena read it, transfixed. Not just by the words, but by the way he had felt everything and chosen to keep it. It was an emotional diary. A place where he had cried out silently. On one of the pages, among reflections on her absence, there was a small highlighted paragraph: "I dreamed about her yesterday. I dreamed that she knocked on my door, smiled, told me she loved me. And I closed the door slowly. I woke up with a heavy heart. Because in that dream, I loved her, but I didn't want her anymore." Helena folded the paper with trembling hands, her eyes moist. It was at that moment that she realized his love, however sincere, had departed. Not out of anger, but out of pain. And when love departs out of pain, it doesn't return. Even if the body returns. Even if words try to rebuild. She cried for hours, not out of anger at Lucas, but for herself. For having unintentionally killed the only love that had ever truly been hers. But the real impact was yet to come. Months later, she saw him. By chance. At a cafe they frequented together. He was sitting at the corner table, an open book, a slight smile on his face. A woman sat in front of him. A serene woman, with a calm gaze and simple gestures. They spoke slowly, unhurriedly, as if they didn't need to prove anything. Helena froze. The world around her seemed to stop. She watched them for a few seconds, and felt her stomach tighten when she saw his hand gently touch hers. This was the new version of him. And she wasn't part of it. She decided to leave before he saw her. She couldn't bear that encounter. Not like that. But fate, ironic as ever, decided she needed to see more. Days later, she received an unexpected invitation. A coworker mentioned she'd recently met someone new, and that he played piano at a small bar on Thursdays. Helena, unsure why, felt a kind of vertigo. She didn't ask his name. She just went. Arriving there, the sound of the piano invaded the room like a vivid memory. And there he was, standing in the center of the room, focused on the keys. There was silence all around. Everyone was listening. His new wife was sitting in the front row. The bar wasn't large, but it was full. His name was on the sign at the entrance, and the owner announced him as someone who had become part of the house. When the song ended, Lucas thanked her with a shy smile. He left the stage, walked between the tables, and kissed the forehead of the woman waiting for him. At that moment, Helena realized something she hadn't fully grasped yet: he was happy. Truly. Not out of revenge. Not to show he'd overcome. But because he'd rebuilt. Without destroying anyone in the process. She wanted to hide, but it was too late. He saw her. A brief second of silence between them. Helena took a deep breath and walked toward him. The encounter was brief. They left the salon and met outside. He greeted her politely, with a restrained smile. She didn't know what to say. She tried to bring up some random topic, but soon gave in to her emotions. She said she still thought about him. That she dreamed about him. That she carried the guilt every day. Lucas listened patiently. He didn't interrupt her. And when she finished, his voice breaking, he said he had already forgiven her. That he no longer held any grudges. But there was also no more room. He said he understood what she felt, but that he needed to be faithful to what he had rebuilt. That she had been part of a beautiful story, but now she was living a different one. And that this new story deserved peace. Helena nodded, trying not to break down right there. Before he left, he handed her an envelope. He said it was the last part of a chapter he needed her to read. She took the envelope home and, upon opening it, found a text he had written. It was the last excerpt from the emotional diary she had found months earlier. And there lay the secret. Something she could never have imagined. In the text, he described a recurring dream. One in which the two of them were at home, laughing, cooking together, just like old times. She apologized, saying she wanted to get back together, that she'd made a mistake. He said he still loved her, but there was something he needed to tell her. And then, in the dream, he revealed, "I betrayed you too. Not with someone else, but with the idea that you were still who you used to be. I betrayed our love when I refused to see that you were gone long before we packed our bags. I betrayed my own intuition, believing that what we felt was enough, even when everything screamed that it wasn't. And that was the most painful betrayal of all." Helena let the paper fall to the floor. She was silent for minutes. That secret wasn't an act. It was a raw, profound, emotional truth. Lucas had never cheated on her with anyone else, but he had betrayed himself, trying to hold on to a love that was already broken. He tried to hold on to her as before, even when she was no longer the same. And in doing so, he betrayed himself. His forgiveness, now, made perfect sense. It was a forgiveness that came from someone who had understood his own failure, not of behavior, but of hope. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Love, when unrequited, becomes sacrifice. And sometimes, those who love too much also make mistakes. They make mistakes by insisting. By ignoring the signs. By giving up. Helena realized the price she paid was high. But Lucas had paid his too. And now, they were even. Just on different paths. Helena didn't sleep that night. The envelope lay closed on the living room table, but its contents were already etched into her skin as if tattooed raw. She felt the weight of Lucas's words more intensely than any direct accusation. He hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown anything in her face, hadn't humiliated her, hadn't pointed fingers. And yet, everything inside her hurt. It hurt with surgical precision, with a depth no fight could reach. That text was a farewell written with cruel tenderness, like someone undressing without provocation. Lucas had acknowledged his own betrayal, not against her, but against himself. And it was then that everything fell apart completely, not because of the guilt of what she had done, but because of the realization that he, even after everything, still held himself responsible for having loved her beyond his time. In the following days, Helena tried to regain some semblance of routine, but there was no structure. Life had moved on for everyone around her, but internally, she was paralyzed. The image of Lucas playing the piano wouldn't leave her mind. Not out of jealousy or possession, but because of the serenity with which he carried on. Because of the lightness she had taken from him for so long and that now, finally, he had reclaimed with someone else. It was difficult to accept that she had become the weight that prevented someone from being happy. She began to avoid the places they frequented together, blocked memories on social media, put everything that reminded her of him in a box and hid it in the back of the closet. It wasn't spite. It was grief. The grief of the love she had killed with impulsive decisions, and of which now only echoes remained in her mind. A month later, on a rainy Friday afternoon, she received an unexpected invitation. Lucas's girlfriend, Julia, had sent her a message. Not angrily, not sarcastically, but with unexpected kindness. She said she wanted to talk. Helena hesitated for hours. She considered ignoring it. She considered responding coldly. She considered pretending she'd never received it. But something about that message resonated with her. Maybe it was the lack of judgment, or the courage inherent in the proposal. The next day, they met at a discreet coffee shop on the opposite side of town. Helena arrived first. Julia entered a few minutes later, unhurried, with a restrained smile and a firm gaze. The initial silence was dense, but not hostile. Julia ordered tea, Helena coffee. The rain beat against the windows with hypnotic constancy. Julia was the first to speak. He said he had no intention of reopening wounds, nor of competing for truths. He simply wanted to understand. Not understand betrayal, but understand Lucas. He said he loved him. And that, to love him completely, he also needed to know the parts he didn't say out loud. Helena lowered her eyes, unsure how to react. She hadn't expected that. Julia continued, saying that Lucas had told her everything, or almost everything. He had spoken of the separation, the pain, the distance, but never with rancor. Always with care. And she, as a woman, sensed there was something more there, something he couldn't or wouldn't fully reveal. Helena took a deep breath. She said she didn't know where to begin, that if she could go back, she would have done everything differently. Julia nodded. She said she didn't want judgment or justifications, just honesty. And then, between sips of coffee and heavy gazes, Helena began to speak. She said that for a time, she felt Lucas had stopped seeing her. That her professional growth was accompanied by an emotional loneliness she couldn't name. That she felt admired, but not understood. She said she wasn't looking for another love, nor did she even desire betrayal. But that, in a moment of weakness, she accepted what seemed like a shortcut to feeling seen. That she regretted it the next second, but it was too late. And that the greatest pain wasn't losing Lucas, it was realizing he would still have fought for her, even after everything. Julia listened in silence, her eyes brimming with tears. She said she now understood the weight Lucas carried, even when he smiled. She said she understood his tiredness in the wee hours of the morning, when he seemed distant. That she now knew there were wounds in him that not even the most sincere love could completely erase. But she also said she would love him anyway. That she wasn't expecting an intact man, but a whole man within her means. Helena swallowed hard. For the first time, she saw the love between them in a real way. Not as a trophy of overcoming, but as something built on rubble. And that was more beautiful than she could bear. At the end of the conversation, Julia stood, extended her hand, and said thank you. Helena shook it firmly, but inside, she was already in pieces. She returned home with her eyes fixed on the floor, as if carrying tons of regret on her shoulders. Arriving home, he opened the box hidden in the closet. He took out Lucas's old letters, the forgotten notes, the photos faded from the wall. He spread them all out on the bed. That was where she needed closure. Once and for all. He burned everything. One by one. Unhurriedly. He let the smell of smoke fill the room, like a ritual farewell. There was no going back. There wouldn't be. But perhaps, in time, there would be peace. Months passed. Autumn arrived. An unexpected invitation appeared in her email. Lucas was holding a visual arts exhibition, a project he'd been developing for years, but only now taking public form. The invitation was signed by him. There were no hidden notes. No subliminal messages. Just a sober invitation. Helena took 2 days to decide to go. But she went. Alone. She arrived punctually, touring the rooms leisurely. The walls were lined with works that blended design, photography, and short texts. There was something deeply personal in each piece. Some bore handwritten phrases, others were deconstructed images of faces in black and white. In the center of the last room was an installation. A dining table set for two. On it were 2 empty plates, 2 half-filled glasses of wine, and, in the center, an open letter. It was the final text of the diary. That same letter he had delivered months ago. Framed, printed on handmade paper. Beside it, a small sign with the phrase, "Forgiving is not going back. It is letting go in peace." Helena stood there for long minutes. People around her walked, commented, admired. But she heard nothing more. She read every line of the letter as if for the first time. She left the gallery in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. For the first time, she truly breathed. She let the air in deeply, without guilt, without pain. Just a clean void. A space where before there had been turmoil. Lucas saw her from afar, but didn't go to her. He knew it was no longer necessary. Their story had ended with dignity. Without scandal. Without ruin. Only with the truth. And the truth, even when it hurts, sets you free. And so, each went their own way. He, with a new love. She, with a new outlook on herself. And life, with a chapter closed. Not with a full stop, but with a silent ellipsis. Because some stories don't end. They just transform who we become after living them. As she left the gallery that night, Helena felt a different silence accompany her steps. It was no longer the silence of abandonment, nor the suffocating silence of absences that had once surrounded her. It was an internal, mature silence that emerges only when one accepts the definitive defeat of a battle fought for a long time, but which no longer made sense. For the first time, she no longer felt the urge to chase, to rewrite history, to seek a rapprochement. That exhibition, that framed letter in front of so many people, had shown her that the chapter had been closed not only by Lucas, but by time itself, by the choices she had made and the consequences she now understood without needing anyone to point them out. She walked the empty streets with the feeling that something inside her had also emptied. Not bitterly or melancholically, but with the lucidity of someone who has finally understood that love, however great, cannot survive alone, nor can it resist the carelessness of those who believe they will always have another chance. In the following weeks, she began to look at her own life with a kind of unprecedented sobriety. There were no more crises, no more desperate attempts at repair. She began making small changes to the apartment, repainting the living room wall, rearranging the books, and getting rid of objects that carried heavy memories. Not out of resentment or an attempt to erase the past, but out of a need for space. She needed to see herself outside the version of herself she had become while in that relationship. She began walking in the late afternoons, frequented a nearby library, and resumed old habits she had abandoned. There was still pain, yes, but it was accompanied by understanding. It was a pain that no longer grounded her, that required no justifications or fantasies. It was a clean pain. And that, in a way, was also freedom. Lucas, for his part, was immersed in a new routine marked by emotional stability and resolved silence. He no longer carried the weight of what had been. He shared his life with someone who didn't demand constant proof of love, who understood his pauses, his restrained gestures, and who knew how to distinguish silence from absence. Julia was a firm and gentle presence. She didn't suffocate him with expectations, nor demand words he couldn't say. Lucas was finding himself again, not only as a man, but as someone who had learned to protect his affection without needing to isolate himself. The piano, which for years had been merely a solitary refuge, was now also a form of expression, sharing what he previously couldn't name. And even though the past still visited him from time to time, it no longer dominated him. It no longer hurt. It was simply part of him. Time followed its course, as it always does, and with it came new seasons. Helena became involved in volunteer projects, dedicating part of her weekends to community activities. There, she found a purpose unrelated to relationships or external validation. She met new people but avoided romantic involvement. Not out of fear, but because she now understood the depth that surrender requires. She no longer wanted lukewarm relationships, nor involvements that served as patches for old deficiencies. She was willing to wait. And while she waited, she rebuilt herself. During one of these voluntary encounters, he met someone different. A simple, discreet man who expressed himself more through his gaze than through words. They shared similar tastes, laughed easily, and, above all, respected each other's silences. There was no overwhelming passion, no exaggerated promises. But there was something there. Something that grew slowly, carefully, like a plant sprouting in soil previously considered barren. Helena didn't tell him much about her past. Just the essentials. She said she had lived an intense story, that she had learned a lot, and that now she preferred to take things slowly. He understood. And that was enough. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as an idealized version of herself, but as she was in that moment, imperfect, regretful, and yet capable of starting over. In another corner of the city, Lucas was also facing his dilemmas. Julia, who had always known about his past, began to notice that he was avoiding certain topics. Not about Helena, but about himself. She loved him sincerely, but didn't want to live in the shadow of a man who carried unresolved wounds. One night, after a simple dinner, she confronted him gently. She said she didn't want to be a refuge. She wanted to be a choice. And that she understood the traumas, but needed to know if she was building with someone whole, or just with what remained of someone who hadn't yet allowed themselves to love fully again. Lucas was silent for a few moments, staring intently at the glass in front of him. Then he looked up, touched her hand, and told her that, for the first time, he was exactly where he wanted to be. And that the peace she brought was the only reason he had been able to leave the past in its proper place. These dilemmas, though silent, revealed the depth of the choices they had both made. Helena, recognizing her mistake, sought redemption in no one but herself. And Lucas, accepting what he felt, didn't use pain as a shield to avoid new bonds. Both, in different ways, were trying to find the right balance between what they were and what they could become. Neither emerged unscathed, but both were transformed. As time passed, Helena met Julia again by chance. They were at a social event hosted by the library, where they both, coincidentally, were involved. The reunion was unexpected, but not uncomfortable. They greeted each other respectfully, exchanged few words, and went their separate ways that night. But there was something in their eyes that said more than any conversation. They both knew what it meant to experience something real with Lucas, and both were aware of what had to be given up so he could find peace. It was a silent, almost fraternal recognition between two women who, through opposite paths, were part of the same life, the same story, and who now understood that no one emerges from love unscathed, but that emerging different is sometimes the greatest way to grow. One Saturday afternoon, Lucas received a letter. Handwritten, with no return address. He recognized the handwriting before even opening it. Helena didn't apologize. She didn't ask for a response. She simply talked about life, about her new love, about how much she had learned. She said she now understood that love isn't just about presence, but about constancy, daily choices, and respect for what the other person offers. And that, as painful as their ending had been, she was grateful. Because it was in loss that she found herself. The letter ended with a phrase that stuck with him for a long time: "When I learned to live without you, I realized how much of myself there was still to discover." Lucas kept the letter. Not as a reminder of a love that ended, but as a symbol of a cycle that had closed with dignity. There was no more unresolved pain, no more unanswered questions. What remained now was maturity. And perhaps this was the most profound form of love he had ever known, self-love, rebuilt from the ruins of an unrequited surrender. That story, made of mistakes and successes, of silences and unspoken words, didn't end with villains or heroes. It was, above all, human. And like every human story, it carried layers of choices, moral dilemmas, legitimate pain, and lessons learned that only time can reveal. What began as a breakup now revealed itself as a mutual liberation. And even though they both followed different paths, there was, between them, an invisible bridge made of respect, belated understanding, and a certainty: some stories aren't meant to last, but to teach. And this one, without a doubt, taught more than any happy ending could. The following month, life seemed to breathe a little more deeply, as if everything were finally settling into place. Encounters with the past became less frequent, not out of indifference, but out of a kind of serene acceptance that certain wounds don't need to be opened to be understood. Helena continued rebuilding a new version of herself, one that no longer apologized for existing, but also no longer demanded forgiveness for every mistake made. The man she had met through volunteering, Thomas, wasn't a fresh start disguised as salvation. He was someone who entered her life with the lightness of someone without exaggerated expectations, just presence and a genuine willingness to explore the truth behind every layer. And that was, in some ways, what she needed most: someone who would see her without filters or judgment. One afternoon, they were walking through a street fair, chatting about trivialities, when she, unexpectedly, spoke about Lucas's exhibition. She said she'd been there, seen everything, read the letter, and understood. Thomas didn't ask questions, just listened. And when she finished, he responded with a simple sentence: "The things that change us usually hurt." After that, they continued in silence for a few minutes, without any awkwardness. It was the first time in a long time that she had allowed herself to share something so profound without being interrupted by advice, consolation, or interpretations. Thomas respected the timing of words and the spaces between them. And it was in this simplicity that he became essential, without promising eternity or filling gaps that didn't fit. He simply stayed. And sometimes, that was all someone needed. Lucas, for his part, saw his routine taking on more defined contours. His creative projects were flowing, performances became more frequent, and his relationship with Julia was entering a phase of quiet maturity. Their words were less intense, but more genuine. One day, she surprised him with a short trip, a weekend away, to a remote location where cell phone reception barely worked and time seemed slower. Sitting on the porch of a rustic inn, amidst the smell of wood and the sound of wind through the trees, Julia asked if he still thought about Helena. Not with jealousy, but with that raw honesty that only those who truly love can muster. Lucas took a deep breath, stared at the horizon for a few seconds, and replied that, yes, sometimes he did. But not like before. He said the memories came back like old scenes from a movie he'd seen many times before and now no longer felt the need to rewatch. He added that what he experienced with Helena taught him a lot about what he wanted, and what he would never accept again. Julia smiled, not because she heard he was thinking about someone else, but because she knew he knew exactly where he was now, and with whom. Upon returning from his trip, Lucas was met with some news, an invitation to participate in a contemporary art conference, where one of his works had been selected for exhibition. The news surprised him. For a long time, he had doubted his own talent. During his relationship with Helena, his art had become secondary, something reserved for leisure time. But now, it was central, pulsating. He shared the news with Julia, and she embraced him with sincere enthusiasm, as if proud of something she had also helped nurture. In preparation for the event, Lucas revisited old drafts, including the notebook where he had written much of his reflections after the separation. He hadn't reread it in months. Upon opening it, he found a page marked with a rusty paperclip. It was an unfinished text. A letter that began addressed to himself and ended abruptly with a passage that read, "The day you stop waiting for the return of those who were, will be the day you are finally free to go." Rereading those words, he felt a lump in his throat, but also a sense of relief. Not because he had moved on, but because he understood that sometimes freedom begins when you abandon hope. That same month, Helena learned about Thomas's exhibition. It was a smaller but significant event for him, focused on sustainability and social design. He had spent weeks working on a project with local communities, and the exhibition would mark the end of the initiative. Helena accompanied him discreetly, without placing herself at the center of anything. She observed everything with a discreet gaze, admiring not only his work but also the way he positioned himself in the world, without needing to prove anything, without seeking recognition. At the end of the evening, he took her for coffee and, casually, asked if she felt ready to truly start over. Helena took a while to answer. She looked at him with a mixture of affection and fear, saying she didn't yet know what it meant to truly start over, but she knew what she didn't want to repeat. Thomas nodded and replied that sometimes, knowing what to avoid was a good start. Time passed with the gentleness that only comes when urgency no longer dictates the pace of choices. Helena, now more centered, found pleasure in small achievements, watching her plants grow, being able to sleep without needing music to drown out her thoughts, preparing simple dinners for someone who stayed until the end, not because she wanted something in return, but because she enjoyed being there. Lucas, for his part, received positive feedback on his presentation at the conference, gained visibility, and received proposals for future collaborations. But between these moments of personal glory, there were also moments when the past whispered quietly. One night, while organizing her digital files, she found an old folder with forgotten photos. She didn't have the courage to open them all, but she clicked on one, a dinner at home, a set table, laughter frozen in an instant. It was a beautiful but dead memory. She deleted the folder. Not with anger, but with the knowledge that carrying it around no longer made sense. On another cloudy afternoon, while walking through a sparsely frequented park, Lucas saw a familiar silhouette from afar. Helena was sitting on a bench, reading alone. Her hair was shorter, her shoulders less tense, her gaze focused. She didn't approach. She watched for a few minutes and then continued on her way. There was an implicit respect there. A silent pact that some reunions don't need to happen for two stories to intersect with dignity. Each had already said what needed to be said, albeit in different ways. The peace between them came not from direct contact, but from the maturity of knowing that the love that existed didn't need to be rekindled to be validated. Later that week, Julia found a letter from Lucas on the piano. It was short. It said she'd never believed in destiny, but was certain some pain had to exist for him to be able to love her properly. The letter ended with a sentence, "Thank you for not asking me to forget, but for reminding me who I am." Julia read it silently, then slipped the letter into a book and put it away on the shelf. He knew their story was still being written, but with clean pages, no ghosts lurking between the lines. That same night, Helena began writing again. Something she hadn't done since her time with Lucas. She sat down at her computer and let the words flow. She wasn't yet sure if it was a short story, a letter, or simply a rant. But she wrote as if she needed to organize her feelings, not to share them with anyone, but to recognize herself after so many versions. And, at the end of the text, she wrote a single sentence that would stay with her for the rest of her life: "I lost someone who loved me, but I found myself again on the way back." Life went on. With unexpected encounters, subtle decisions, and a growing awareness of what it means to truly love someone, and, most importantly, what it means to honestly love yourself. And even though Lucas and Helena's paths would never cross again, there was something neither of them could deny: that failed love was also what made them grow. It wasn't a cursed love. It was a love poorly lived. But in the end, it gave each of them exactly what they needed to learn. And that learning, indeed, would last forever. Time passed as if I were in a hurry to heal what my heart was still slow to fully accept. And before I knew it, 2 years had passed since that last night when Helena and Lucas, despite being far apart, finally said goodbye. 2 years in which their paths never crossed again physically, but continued, from time to time, colliding in silent memories and thoughts that came unexpectedly, in banal moments, like a forgotten perfume in the air, a song playing softly in a random room, or the sight of someone walking with the same posture, the same rhythm, the same silence in their gaze. That wasn't a longing for love, but for the intimacy that once existed, and that now existed only in the past, untouchable and unattainable, like everything that ends before its time. Helena moved on, now in a more stable relationship with Thomas, who, with his unwavering patience and constant presence, had become a kind of harbor where she could anchor without fear. It wasn't an intense relationship like the ones she used to have, but it was true and light, 2 words she'd previously despised for seeming lukewarm, but which were now synonymous with peace. With him, she learned to slow down. She learned to ask for forgiveness without perpetually blaming herself. She learned to listen without expecting an immediate response. But, most importantly, she learned not to repeat herself. And even though she'd never recounted in detail everything she'd experienced with Lucas, Thomas knew, in her silences, that it had been a founding pain. He accepted it naturally. And that was more than enough. One morning, waking up earlier than usual, Helena went down to the living room and found an envelope on the table. Inside was an invitation. Unsigned, uninscribed. It was for an exhibition in another city. One name caught her eye among the invited artists: Lucas. She didn't hesitate. She called Thomas and told him. She said she wanted to go. Not with the intention of reuniting, but because she wanted to see who he had become artistically. Thomas, without a hint of jealousy, said he supported her. And that if she wanted, he would go with her. Helen refused. She needed to do this alone. She needed to end a cycle on her own 2 feet. He traveled the following weekend. The exhibition was smaller than the previous one, but more sophisticatedly curated. Upon entering the gallery, his heart beat differently. There was a central theme: reconnections. Each work told a story about returning to oneself, about finding something lost. Walking among the paintings, he arrived at a secluded room where only a single piece was displayed, a simple installation made of strands of light woven together to form a kind of net suspended in the air. In the center, hanging by a golden thread, was a piece of paper with a single handwritten sentence: "We only truly reconnect when we accept that we are no longer the same as before." Helena stood there, her eyes fixed on that sentence, trying to absorb its depth. She didn't see Lucas. She didn't know if he was there, if he had seen her, if she knew she was coming. But it didn't matter. That message was what she needed. And she left with the certainty that she no longer needed to carry that open chapter within herself. It was closed. Closed with art, with delicacy, with respect. Meanwhile, Lucas was also going through a decisive moment. Julia, who had been by his side for so long, had received a job offer in another country. And, for the first time, they faced a difficult choice. It wasn't a breakup, but a new challenge: stay together long distance or go their separate ways. They spent nights talking about it, and the conclusion wasn't dramatic or tearful. It was simply the mature understanding that some people come into our lives to help us find ourselves again, and that sometimes that's enough. Julia left months later, and they decided not to freeze their relationship or make eternal promises. They kept in touch, exchanged messages, but knew that each now needed to navigate their own path. It was during this period of peaceful solitude that Lucas wrote his first book. It wasn't a novel, nor a biography, but a collection of chronicles about the phases of love. About the versions of oneself that emerge when one loves, loses, betrays, and begins anew. The book was released discreetly, without major publicity. And yet, it gained traction among readers who saw themselves in those words. Among stories that didn't end with reunions, but with silent reconciliations with one's own truth. At a small literary event, Helena found a copy of the book. She bought it and read it in silence for 2 nights. On every page, she recognized pieces of the two of them, not as a couple, but as beings who survived each other. When she finished, she didn't cry. She simply closed the book and wrote her name on the cover, along with the date. It was her final destination. Some time later, Lucas received a letter. It was from Helena's sister. It said their mother had passed away, and that Helena was not well. The news shook him more than he could have imagined. Out of respect for what they had experienced, he decided to go to the wake, discreetly, with no intention of consoling or reconnecting. He arrived late, near the end. He stood in the back, watching. Helena was pale, haggard, but serene. At a certain point, she saw him. She walked toward him with slow steps. The embrace was silent, tender, wordless. Her eyes said it all. She thanked him for coming with a wave. He nodded. And then, once again, they went in opposite directions. No hard feelings. No promises. Only with the peace of knowing they did what they could. Today, Helena lives in a small house on the outskirts, living a simple, peaceful life, cultivating her plants, writing for herself and teaching creative writing to teenagers. Thomas, now her friend, married another woman, and the two still exchange messages on special occasions. Lucas continues to write and play music, and lives alone, but never alone. He receives letters from readers, invitations to lectures, and still carries in his gaze the calm of someone who no longer waits for anyone else to be complete. Both, in their own way, found what they were looking for. It wasn't the ending they expected. But it was the ending they needed. If you've made it this far, you've certainly felt the weight and truth of this story firsthand. Now tell me, what did you think of this journey? What part resonated with you the most? Leave your comment below, we want to hear your opinion. And of course, if you're not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel now. Every week we have profound stories like this, designed to touch your soul and provoke real reflection. And before we close, here's a truth this story teaches us: betrayal doesn't just break promises, it destroys homes, erodes trust, and, above all, kills the love that was once pure. Cheating isn't a momentary mistake, it's a choice that changes destinies, destroys memories, and transforms entire lives. Therefore, this channel will never support any kind of betrayal, whatever the reason. Here, we believe in true love, mutual respect, and the conscious construction of honest relationships. Until the next story.